Hi, everyone. Welcome. Just going to let everyone in before we started. There we go. Thank you. Great. Let's just wait one more minute, make sure everyone comes in. And oops, I'm going to be running the slides just because we had a little technical difficulty getting approval on that. So apologies in advance for anyone as I maneuver through this. Wait one more minute before we get started. I'm going to, Annalise and Christina, are you guys all set if I want to go ahead and start introducing you both?
Yep.
Yes.
Great. All right.
And Melissa, I can admit people while you're doing the introduction.
Thank you. That would be great. That would be wonderful.
Great place.
All right, well, welcome everyone. This is generally the time that the IC2 PFAS work group meets, so they are hosting this presentation today for all of you. Today we have Christina Ross from Credo Beauty. She's a senior scientist, and Credo Beauty is the largest clean beauty retailer, brick and mortar and online. She works with her team to address key industry challenges, such as ingredient transparency, and has worked to update retail's strongest clean policy that all of Credo's brands must comply with. Her background is in microbiology, public health, and toxicology. And we're also joined today by Annalise Conway. She's an associate scientist at Integral Consulting, and they're an environmental consulting and engineering company. They deal with a wide variety of environmental concerns. Annalise works with the Toxicology, Health, and Ecological Sciences Group on a variety of project types, including human health risk assessments, personal care products testing, and ecological risk assessments. Her background is in ecotoxicity and environmental science. And I'm going to pull up their presentation.
Hello.
Hello. And that with you all. So let me get that going. Presentation. Great, and I'm all set to go whenever you guys would like me to change the slides.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having us today to present. Annalise and I both are excited to talk about this broad and a bit confusing topic of PFAS and cosmetics. And I know this group is well versed in the PFAS world, but maybe potentially not in the cosmetic specific arena. So we're going to focus on that today. Feel free to ask questions live, interrupt us, whatever makes sense. We hope that this is a good back and forth conversation, and anything that we can learn from you all as well is very welcome. So I'd love to hear your experiences and as well as your questions. So next slide, please. Thank you so much for running the slides. The table of contents is a bit daunting. Don't be afraid. We just want to give a general overview today of all things PFAS and cosmetics. So we wanted to touch on a little bit of a bunch of different areas. So we're going to go into general overview of just why PFAS might be found in cosmetics. And then we'll talk about exposure, human exposure, and environmental exposure and disposal. We'll go into state legislation, some advocacy that's going on, requirements for retailers and how that's an ever-changing area. We'll talk about some public action highlights and what consumers are kind of doing to help demand change. Some changes that retailers are putting out forth despite, no federal regulations. We'll talk about exposure routes.
You mean?
And then super interesting, I think, will be the back half of the conversation. We'll go into PFAS in colorants, PFAS in drums, and in packaging, and how that all relates to PFAS in cosmetics. And then we'll speak to cosmetic testing and the world of testing of PFAS in cosmetics. And then we'll get into a bit of diligence and what's next. So that is what we'll discuss today. But again, please chime in with any questions or experiences as we speak. We're very interested to hear.
Great. So I'll talk a little bit to the kind of general overview of PFAS and cosmetics. So certain PFAS may be intentionally added as ingredients to some cosmetic products, including lotions, cleansers, nail polish, shaving cream, foundation, lipsticks, eyeliner, eyeshadow, mascara, pretty much the works. These PFAS are used in cosmetics to condition and smooth the skin, making it appear shiny, or to affect product consistency and texture. Also noted, a lot of them will be used in like long-lasting products, long wear, to help, keep the product, acting the same way throughout your day. Some PFAS may also be present in cosmetics unintentionally as a result of raw materials impurities or due to the breakdown of PFAS ingredients that form other types of PFAS. Go to the next slide. Thank you. So there are a number of ways that, you could be exposed to PFAS. I'm sure you guys are pretty well versed on this. It could include drinking water, food, packaging, household products and dust, and personal care products like we're talking about today. And this, as we kind of hinted in our overview, will also include their packaging as well. So, I put a kind of a simplistic overview of how, PFAS may enter the environment. The one I didn't include is, just direct disposal. You don't use a certain product in its lifespan, or you don't like it anymore and you just, throw it out and it ends up in a landfill. That's one way, but assuming you actually use the product, there's kind of two ways that it can end up getting into our environment. The first would be kind of direct emission. You put on, a lotion or a face full of makeup and you go swimming or something like that. It rinses off in the water. The other option would be, you use the product and you wash your face at the end of the day, you wash your hands, you take a shower. That product ends up going down the drain. Then it makes its way into wastewater treatment facilities. And these PFAS may or may not be broken down by whatever wastewater treatment it's going through. And then those effluents end up, being discharged into the environment. Next slide. So for the state level legislation, there's a number of bills in various stages banning pretty much anything to do with PFAS and cosmetics, selling, manufacturing, delivering, and or using cosmetics or personal care products in general containing PFAS. Some of these states include California, New York, Maryland, Rhode Island. There's a couple others as well. Next slide.
Yeah, I'm impressed you can name all those states just by the pictures, Annalise. So there's a couple of current acts that we wanted to highlight for you specifically. Right now, they're both in the introduction stage. So they have co-sponsors and they've been introduced but haven't gotten much further. The first is the No PFAS in Cosmetics Act. It was introduced in 2021 by a few senators with many co-sponsors. And this act, specifically the language bans intentionally added PFAS. So if it were to pass, there would be no allowed intentionally added PFAS in any sort of personal care or cosmetic product. So this doesn't really get to or touch on the contamination issue, which we'll speak to later in this presentation, but it would ban any ingredient that would be used for purpose, like waterproof mascara would not be allowed to have PFAS used or listed on its ingredient list. The second act kind of tangentially is related to PFAS and cosmetics. It's called the Cosmetic Supply Chain Transparency Act. It's a pretty interesting act. It was introduced in 2021 and also has many co-sponsors. And this act specifically touches on all things supply chain transparency, but there's a specific wording that would ask and require manufacturers and suppliers of raw materials and general industry throughout the supply chain to disclose when they're using PFAS in cleaning materials, in drums, in packaging. Currently, PFAS contamination in cosmetics is an issue and a concern, but you can't necessarily know where the contamination is coming from. So this Supply Chain Transparency Act would help to alleviate some of those pain points. So you would be able to have information from your packaging supplier, and they would have to disclose that they have used PFAS in their packaging, or a raw material ingredient manufacturer would need to disclose that they're using PFAS in the drums that they use to move the raw materials, so on and so forth. So those are the two current federal acts that are in discussion. Next slide, thank you. So right now, what are the regulatory requirements for retailers? It is a patchwork, to say the least. So many state and local governments are changing and updating legislation all the time based on science, based on global regulations, really, and what we're learning about PFAS. So this can make it really difficult for retailers specifically to track and manage what's going on. So we feel that it's best managed if a retailer already has a policy in place. So if a retailer is saying, we ban intentionally added PFAS, we ask suppliers to disclose when they're using PFAS, things like that. That helps a retailer to manage these state and local laws that are changing. There is no national policy right now, but in the future, that could be a potential approach. It would be beneficial, of course, if the national policy was strong and clear and well written. PFAS is a very nuanced topic, and you can't just make a blanket statement across all industries, and even a blanket statement across cosmetics in PFAS or personal care. So in the absence of a national policy, states really should and are taking more proactive approach in this area. Many states have already focused their efforts and enacted some laws and regulations that are certainly at a more fast pace than what the federal government is doing. And just for example, we wanted to let you know, if you're not aware, that the California labeling requirements for PFAS under the Prop 65 rulings just passed in April 2022. So manufacturers are now required to report aftermarket treatment of products that are sold in California that either contain PFAS or are intended for use by consumers and retailers and so forth. So kind of again gets to that transparency aspect. And they have also introduced a bill to ban the manufacture and sale of cosmetic products that contain intentionally added PFAS. We just spoke about that national level policy, but California's moving their bill, looks like, ahead pretty quickly. So if that were to occur and to pass, that would go into effect in 2025.
Christina, do you want to take some questions now on the policy and regulations, or do you want to wait until the end?
Yeah, we can certainly take questions now.
Okay. There was one question about intentionally added.
Okay.
Who decides what is intentionally added in cosmetics, and is there an amount, a part per million limit that defines intentionally added?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the current regulatory writings, there is not an amount or threshold. It's any intentionally added ingredient that would be listed on the ingredient label. And it's FDA requirements that all cosmetic products have to have an ingredient label that's run by the INCI, which is International Nomenclature of Cosmetic Ingredients. So if you're using an ingredient in a product, you must list it on the back of the product or on the label of the product, and you would not be allowed to use a PFAS-based ingredient at any level. And that's the current verbiage. It would not cover, yeah, I see that question. It would not cover processing aids. That's right. The processing aids would kind of be under the transparency, the Supply Chain Transparency Act. So if an ingredient, a PFAS ingredient was used in the processing of a raw material, that would not be covered by this no intentionally added PFAS. And we'll get into that a little bit later, the processing aids, but for example, colorants. So ingredients that are used to impart color, like a blush or a lipstick. Often these colorants are coated in PFAS or can be coated in PFAS, and those are not necessarily disclosed. So you have the colorant listed on the ingredient label of your cosmetic product, but even though PFAS was used in the manufacture of that colorant, it would not be disclosed on the label and therefore not considered intentionally added. That's kind of a gray area right now of how we'll address that, certainly.
Thanks. That's really an interesting example.
Yeah.
Right, of what's intentional to the cosmetics manufacturer versus what's intentional to an upstream supplier.
Right. You're right. Exactly. I think I saw another question. Why are they added to colorants? So PFAS are added to colorants for a variety of reasons. Usually it's to help the color stay longer. It can be added for allowing the colorant to work better with other ingredients because, as you know, PFAS has that kind of waterproof capability. So it can help create the colorant to be a little bit more slick, I guess, and interact with ingredients better. But oftentimes it's to elongate the amount of time that a colorant, can last. What definition or classification scheme is being used to determine what is a PFAS? So there's a variety of regulators that are defining PFAS. So it's typically EPA and OECD that are defining PFAS. And that's the definition that is often pointed to. I don't know, Annalise, if you can speak to that anymore.
No, I think that pretty much covers it. Some wording too of different, bills and whatnot won't just say PFAS, but they'll also just say, perfluorinated compounds. Some will, call out specific, PFAS compounds, PFOS, PFOA, the usual suspects, but.
Yeah. And that being said, OECD and EPA have different, their definitions of PFAS are pretty much the same, but the number of PFAS that they consider in their database are a bit different. I think OECD has about 9,000 and EPA has, 11,000 or vice versa, something like that. So it's definitely an evolving science, and there's new PFAS being discovered or created every day. Are there a lot of proprietary ingredients in cosmetics? Are ingredients subject to chemical hazard assessment? Yes, there can be proprietary ingredients in cosmetics. Certainly it's similar to food. Processing aids are very common. But typically under the FDA, you do have to list your ingredients that you're using for purpose in the cosmetics on your ingredient label, and those need to be INCI listed. So even if you're using a colorant or a titanium oxide or anything in small amounts, under 1%, it's still listed on the back of that ingredient list. Ingredients subject to chemical hazard assessment, that depends on the type of ingredient, the volume, use, but not necessarily are all cosmetic ingredients reviewed under TSCA or some other, hazard assessment. There's not a national policy that I'm familiar with. Typically, FDA says that it's the retailer or the brand's responsibility to maintain safety. So it's up to the manufacturer to hold the data to, in case anyone, needs to go back and look at that. And Annalise, I know you've done a little bit of work in that area. I don't know if there's anything I'm missing there.
No, I think you've covered it.
Okay. To confirm, there's no minimal percentage of a product ingredient associated with what's required listing on an ingredient label. If I understand that question correctly, no, all purposely added ingredients must be included on the ingredient label, regardless of use level. Concerns about tort law, like the L'Oreal lawsuit. So again, that kind of gets to retail responsibility. I'm not exactly sure what that question is getting at, but there are lawsuits on PFAS intentionally added. I believe the L'Oreal lawsuit, I don't know the ins and outs, but I believe L'Oreal has banned PFAS in many of their products starting this year, and potentially, I'm assuming that this tort lawsuit was because someone found incidental PFAS in the product. So that gets to exactly that gray area where L'Oreal is not, they're saying that they're not intentionally adding PFAS anymore. But if you go and test, one of their waterproof mascaras or blushes, you might find incidental PFAS because of this lack of supply chain transparency and PFAS being used in drums or colorants, so on and so forth, which I know we'll speak to a little bit later in this presentation. But retailers, I'm sure, certainly do have concerns. There is liability, but there would only be liability if you are saying that you have absolutely no PFAS in your products whatsoever. And I don't know that any retailer is using that verbiage because you can't control the supply chain right now. You can only control what you are adding to your product. So I'll move on to public action. So consumers are really starting to understand a bit of the science and understand PFAS. You see PFAS in the mass media every day, it seems, especially with food packaging, but it is prevalent to be discussed in the media on cosmetics as well. So the consumer demand for PFAS-free products is growing. And this can really help prompt businesses to make changes. So, here's my plug to put your dollars where you, where is important to you. And this will help have these brands make voluntary changes regardless of any legislation at the state or national level. And there's a fashion industry example that I find really interesting. It hasn't formed in the cosmetics world yet, but maybe soon. There are several organizations that have started to review and grade the policies and practices of retailers in the fashion world related to their PFAS policies. So, Gore-Tex, there's many different types of coatings that you can put on clothing to make them, wrinkle-free, stain-free, stain-proof, waterproof. And these fashion brands are now saying that they're not using PFAS. And there are several organizations that are rating these brands and how they're doing in their PFAS-free related practices. And this can really help to inform consumer purchases because there's really no one source of truth about where PFAS are in your products at this time. You really have to kind of just go off of what the brand or retailer is telling you. So there are organizations that are starting to appear to give consumers a little bit more of that due diligence so that consumers don't have to do it themselves, which I find quite interesting. Next slide. So here's just a little overview of some retailers and brands with policies against PFAS. I work for Credo, so of course I wanted to let you all know that we prohibit PFAS as ingredients and prohibit them in packaging. And we request all brand partners to refrain from using PFAS intentionally. We go further and we ask brands to test PFAS in their products, and we require those test results to be reported to us. Whether or not it's an intentionally added PFAS, we want to know the levels. Fenty Beauty has a policy about no PFAS as ingredients. In 2018, H&M decided that they will not produce any products using PFAS. Clean at Sephora has a program called Clean at Sephora, so they have a specific area that they highlight on their website and in their stores. That it's known as clean beauty, and those products are prohibited from having PFAS or perfluorinated compound ingredients. Similarly, Ulta has an Ulta clean ingredients pillar, so a certain area of their store that they highlight, and in those products highlighted under Ulta's clean ingredients are also not allowed to have any PFAS or PFAS similar compounds. And Whole Foods, of course, has a number of PFAS bans in their beauty products. Let's see, what test protocol? Oh, we will get into that. That is coming. So retailer change highlights. So as you can imagine, it's in the retailer's best interest to make a safe product, to prevent, like we talked about, toxic tort or lawsuits. It's also in a retailer's best interest to ensure they have clear and documented understanding of their products and packaging and how much PFAS might be present. This is needed potentially to achieve compliance if there ever are state or federal laws, but it's also nice to have that due diligence done in-house so that you can speak to it and you know kind of where your thresholds lie, and when you test for PFAS later, you can see if things are increasing or decreasing. And it's, of course, a step towards maintaining consumer trust where you're able to hold your own data. A quote I love is, if you don't tell your safety story, someone else will tell it for you. So if you're not doing your due diligence as a retailer or a brand, someone else will test your product or do it for you, or write a paper. So it's better if you've got the internal information yourself. Some thoughts to consider: if PFAS are ever assigned a hazard substance classification under national law like CERCLA or RCRA, a release reporting requirement would probably go into effect for retailers. So this would be of interest particularly to this group because retailers could be liable as responsible parties for the waste. So you would want documentation ahead of time of what waste you're generating and where you're disposing it and how you should maintain that. So kind of getting all of that in line now is probably smart. I recommend that retailers should participate in public comment periods for any EPA rulemaking that's occurring, which, as Annalise will speak to later, it's occurring rapidly. Retailers should stay up to date on all of the regulatory developments in order to ensure compliance. That goes if you're selling in the US only or globally. And if you have any products or packaging that have been confirmed to contain PFAS, whether it's intentionally or not, you should consider phase out plans, supply chain changes, alternatives, take back programs, the like. Again, only to kind of create a step towards maintaining consumer trust and also to get ahead of probably what the regulation is coming downstream. Let's see this question. How can we change national level policy to prevent not just PFAS, but other future toxic chemicals being allowed in consumer products? Otherwise, it seems this is a situation of whack-a-mole, certainly. And it also puts the burden on the consumer to push industry. Absolutely. That is the golden question. There are many emerging contaminants. PFAS is not the only one, certainly. There's TSCA, which is doing some of the work. I think it's a bit delayed for funding and administration changes and a whole bunch of other reasons. But I can point to TSCA as being one of the areas in which is helping to drive some of the research and change. But ultimately, the way that cosmetics are regulated in the US by FDA is products are kind of assumed to be safe unless proven otherwise. So you can bring a product or ingredient to market and have your internal data. If the FDA ever requests it, you turn it over. But the FDA or other parties aren't necessarily doing checks on new ingredients. So an area that I'm particularly interested, for example, is botanicals. Lots of different botanicals are coming to the market, each quarter, and the data is potentially there, but it's not like there's a national database or a national review or policies in place. So we certainly could find ourselves in this situation with another group of ingredients or another chemical class. And it just kind of speaks to the way that cosmetics are regulated in the US. I don't know, Annalise, if you have other thoughts.
No, yeah, I agree. It's whack-a-mole is a good way of putting it. Yeah, I haven't heard of any long-term strategy for this recurring issue yet, but hopefully one day we'll have some sort of solution to this.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe PFAS is our lesson learned and will kind of be the driving force.
Yeah, maybe. So I'll talk just quickly about exposure routes for PFAS. One of the, concerns about PFAS being in cosmetics, obviously, is, many of us are putting it all over our face every single day. So, kind of the paths that, PFAS could be getting into bodies and exposing people. The first one is that, just disposal of products themselves. You put them into a landfill, they end up leaching into some sort of groundwater, and that groundwater is ingested. The other option is, what really most of us would think about. You put on an eyeliner, the eyeliner, goes in through your tear duct, you have a powder, a bronzer or something, you breathe that in, you end up inhaling the PFAS. Or, you put on a lipstick and throughout your day, you're licking your lips, you're eating, you're drinking, you end up ingesting that. So those are kind of what we would want to consider when determining the risk of PFAS compounds in cosmetics. And this, there are some groups that have attempted to quantify this risk, but it's really in its early stages. And as Christina will talk about, the actual analysis of the compounds is a key part of this that really needs to be nailed down in order to have a high quality risk assessment occur. You can go to the next slide. Next slide. So Christina talked a little to this earlier. How are we getting this, incidental PFAS in products? It's pretty straightforward to see. You can add PFAS for specific reasons for your product itself, but that's not the only way we're getting PFAS in cosmetics and personal care products. So as Christina said, sometimes colorants and pigments are treated with PFAS to have longer lasting color effects, or to act as a dispersant for the colorants. And again, as the questions were asked, these aren't required to be disclosed by manufacturers or included in the product labels or specification sheets. So, this is one of the ways you end up with PFAS in a product that, wasn't intended to have PFAS in that product. Next slide. Another big one we've been alluding to is the PFAS in drums. And, how did how did anyone figure out there were PFAS in drums? Well, kind of by accident. In September 2020, PFAS were reported in a pesticide product. The EPA then issued an information request to the registrant of that product. And after some testing, it was actually discovered that the culprit was the drum itself and not the pesticide. At the beginning of 2021, the EPA recommended the discontinuation of the use of those containers, and that fluorination company was actually subpoenaed. And finally, about a year and a half ago, EPA published the results of these studies. You can go in the next slide. So the question is, why were there fluorinated compounds in the drums? The containers are treated inside and out with fluorine gas, which is highly reactive. That means, you're going to get some non-specific reactions that might occur, and that may yield uncontrollable mixtures. The fluorination itself decreases friction, decreases stickiness, and repels water, which can help getting the product out of the barrels and reducing product waste. If any of you have enjoyed the transition of like soup containers, like plastic soup containers, that now somehow you can pour out all of the soup and there's nothing left on the sides of them, that's obviously a really great for your soup, but really valuable when it comes to products in drums. To get every bit of it back out of that drum is, going to help your, the bottom line essentially. And then the fluorination also creates a chemical barrier, which increases container stability and decreases the permeability. So you're going to get longer life out of the container and longer life out of the product themselves. Next slide. So PFAS can also be found in packaging other than drums. Packaging suppliers can use fluorine-based treatments on packaging as well, and more specifically on certain products like HDPE. These packaging treatments are not required to be disclosed to those purchasing or using the packaging. And again, these are added for the same reasons as, the fluorination occurs to the drums. You're going to get, less stickiness of the product on the edge of the packaging itself, and you're going to get a longer shelf life out of the product. So next slide. So just some, suggestions moving forward, as we did for retailers, packaging also, should be in everyone's mind moving forward. So, if these companies can partner with packaging suppliers to help understand, the packaging origin and grade, the manufacturing products, and the treatments and coatings, like fluorination. And also if they request and or develop documentation for the material additives and residuals, leaching studies, and any stability tests. Again, moving forward as we, hopefully have some sort of regulation that, means we will know what's in every step of the cosmetic product line, from, packaging to manufacturing to whatever, these companies will need some sort of documentation. So, being proactive about that is better. Next slide. Then again, some specific recommendations is to create partnerships between the packaging team, the product development team, and the procurement team. Again, be proactive, which helps avoid surprises along the line, and develop contingency plans and risk communication strategies. In this event where we end up finding out something after the fact. Next slide.
Yeah, thanks, Annalise. It's such an interesting topic. You can see how PFAS was really sold as being, I hate to use the word sustainable, but help with sustainability. If it's eliminating the amount of cleaning materials you need to use, or lessening the amount of water you need to use to rinse a metal drum, or to wash a product out of packaging before it goes to recycling, you can see how there's true benefit to PFAS. It's just unfortunate that there's a lot of downsides to PFAS as well. So it's certainly not the case that we want these qualities to be gone from packaging or metal drums, but we just need a better alternative. And that's really hopefully an area of focus for many scientists, so that we can continue this sustainability arena where we're not wasting product and we're not wasting water to clean out drums, but we're just not using fluorinated compounds to do so. One question I see is any testing of human bioexcretion of PFAS from cosmetics. So yeah, that would be like blood serum analysis or urine analysis. There certainly have been tests done, many human studies, from pregnant women to children to everyone. And Haynes has plenty of data on this. Unfortunately, you're not able to attribute the PFAS that you find in these human serums or excretions to cosmetics specifically, because you're not certain which cosmetics have intentionally added PFAS and what those intentionally added PFAS are. Every brand would have different intentionally added PFAS. And on top of that, you've got the unintentional PFAS that, again, may be from the colorants or the drums. So you wouldn't be able to parse out the PFAS found in human serum to cosmetics specifically. And one of the reasons for that is because PFAS is so ubiquitous. It's in our drinking water, it's in our food packaging, it's also in our cosmetics. So it's kind of a difficult to be able to do that fingerprinting analysis of where it's coming from. And that goes in perfectly with our cosmetic testing for PFAS. So chemical
Christina, I just want to jump in one sec. I want to let you know there is a study out that does attempt to correlate the two. It's in it's in women of color, I believe in Georgia, and they do find a significant association between those who use the most cosmetic products every day and their PFAS level, I believe, in serum. Just wanted to throw that in there. It's the only one I've seen so far that it's attempted that.
Okay, was that published this year?
I believe so, yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so the work is being done. Yeah, I would love a link to that.
Yeah, I will look at it right now while you talk.
Perfect. Yeah, so that's interesting. They're finding higher PFAS loads in women who are using or reported to use a higher level of cosmetics.
Yep.
Okay, so chemical fingerprinting. Unfortunately, there's no source of truth really for cosmetic testing of PFAS at this time, and I'm going to go into all of the reasons why. So because PFAS in cosmetics don't have specific analytical standards or analytical method developments of specific chemical compounds that might have been added to cosmetics. So the detection of PFAS in cosmetics can be quite difficult, as well as the quantification or, creating a threshold amount or finding a specific amount of PFAS in cosmetics. And I'll go into a bit of that more, but that's just kind of the lay of the land for right now. And I'll get into some more details. But basically, there's targeted analysis for PFAS and non-targeted analysis. So targeted analysis is, what PFAS you're looking for, and there's a test that can detect it. A non-targeted analysis is you don't know what PFAS might be in your cosmetic product, but it could be unintentionally added or a contamination byproduct. So there's several methods to get to each of these. The first two test methods are total organic fluorine and extractable organic fluorine. And these are non-target analyses where they're just looking at the amount of organic fluorine in a product that could potentially be a PFAS. And then the targeted analysis is the EPA draft method 1633. Important to note it's a draft method. Again, this science is rapidly evolving. EPA is even still, accepting comments and feedback on this method. This method tests for specific PFAS analytes. There are about 40 that it can test for, but it might not be all of the PFAS compounds that are potentially present. So typically it's nice to either know exactly what PFAS you're looking for, which of course then it would have been listed on the ingredient label, and many brands are getting away from intentionally added PFAS. So if you don't know what you're looking for exactly, you might want to run the total organic fluorine test first as a screening test. It's a direct oxygen combustion method. It has a pretty low amount of sample, and it yields a pretty low reporting limit. So it just looks at the total amount of organic fluorine, which means it could be a potential PFAS, but it's not PFAS specific. It's pretty easy and cheap to run, but you're going to get a number that doesn't correlate necessarily with true amount of PFAS in your product. And then you have extractable organic fluorine, which is a combustion chromatography method. It's got a much lower reporting limit, which can be helpful to really nail down potential PFAS in the product. But again, it's not a targeted analysis. It's just going to give you kind of a holistic view of what could potentially be in your product. Really important to note, there's no approved test method by the FDA or by industry for testing PFAS in cosmetics. Most of these tests that I've just spoken to are conducted in soils and sediments and even water. So it's more of these are more of environmental testing approaches. So the labs default to this for cosmetics, but these have not been developed for cosmetics specifically. I'm in conversation with several labs often, and this is a revolving door. So even in the next 6 months to a year, there might be more options available, but it's certainly a growing area. Next slide. So as I mentioned, a stepwise approach is usually the most cost-effective method. I think you probably saw my last slide. The targeted analysis can run about $800 a sample. And of course, you don't want to do just one sample. You want to run a triplicate. So say you've got 40 colors of lipstick and you run 3 samples on each of those 40 lipsticks. Certainly a large multinational company could pay for that type of testing, but smaller beauty brands would probably not be able to afford that. And additionally, because colorants have PFAS added and drums and cleaning equipment, you want to do this test regularly. This is not a one and done type of test. You wouldn't get accurate results because the supply chain varies so much. So the most cost-effective method we've come up with so far is to run first the total organic fluorine tests, see what your levels are, if they're above the reporting limit or above a certain threshold that a retailer decides upon. You might want to follow by the extractable organic fluorine to get a lower limit of detection, use a larger sample size, run in triplicate. And then if you are seeing potential levels of concern, you might want to pursue additional targeted analysis using that EPA draft method, which again is $800 a sample, but it could specifically point to PFAS in your products. Again, there's a limitation there because it's only looking at 40 different PFAS. So if you get a non-detect, it doesn't necessarily mean you don't have PFAS in your product. It just means you don't have one of those 40. And those 40 are developed from soil and sediment testing, not necessarily cosmetics. So it's usually the more common, but PFAS, but not necessarily the only PFAS that could be available. So you're never going to get the full story, unfortunately, with our testing capabilities currently. Next slide. So the general thought that labs like to cite is that PFAS measured at about 0.1 micrograms per gram or ppm is usually intentionally added. So if you're seeing a level at 0.1 ppm or higher, it's an intentionally added ingredient. If results are less than that, it might be considered a trace amount that's due to contamination, such as a supply chain issue, a raw material in a drum, so on and so forth. Important to note, it's not uncommon at all to see variations in laboratory results between the lots and the batches of product. It can be due to the fact that there's not a one-size-fits-all laboratory approach right now. It could also be due to contamination within the lab because PFAS are so ubiquitous. It could be due to the fact that one colorant has been treated with a PFAS and that same colorant in the next lot was treated with a different PFAS or treated less. Again, with that supply chain transparency issue, you just don't necessarily know. But it's quite frustrating when you run a triplicate sample on one type of blush and get 3 different results, which is not uncommon to see. Next slide. Let's see if there's any questions.
No, thank
yes,
you, Christopher, for linking to that. That's the study I was referring to.
Is there some other legitimate fluorine fluoride chemical that you would expect in a cosmetic that's not PFAS? Yes, potentially, not necessarily an added chemical, but if it's a natural product that's using, products from the earth, clays, all sorts of different areas, you certainly, I mean, fluorine is a naturally occurring ingredient. Fluoride is also an added ingredient depending on what product you're using. Trying to think of I don't know if you have any other thoughts, Annalise, but there certainly are some legitimate uses. And just that's why I guess you want to look for organic fluorine and not inorganic, because you would typically see the inorganics as something coming from the earth in your clays or minerals or treatments, but the organic, meaning that it's combined with carbon, that's a little bit more pointing to a potential PFAS contamination. Do you have any other thoughts, Annalise?
No, yeah, those are the ones I was thinking of as well.
Okay, cool. So we wanted to talk about, with the last 10 minutes, what Credo's doing, what Integral's doing, and then kind of the future forward. And then, of course, we'll have a few minutes for questions. So as you know, PFAS at Credo are banned from products and packaging. We work with our brand partners and contract manufacturing to ask them to only stock ingredients from suppliers that have letters showing no fluorinated compounds, and that's specific even to pigments. So we try to get as much documentation as possible. We prohibit PFAS from cleaning products that are used in the manufacturing facilities of brands, and we ask for any facilities to disclose any and all uses of PFAS on their premise. Of course, there's no regulation, so we can't necessarily police all of this, but these are our asks. We ask color ingredient suppliers to test raw ingredients for organic fluorine and specific PFAS when possible. And we ask this information to be shared with our community. So they share it with us, me, and then we try to share it with community to kind of keep the discourse going. We're not trying to get anyone in trouble, but the more that people are talking about this, the more we can learn from each other. And then we're trying to establish a protective and attainable protocol for color brands. So blushes, lipsticks, eyeshadows, anything that's imparting color, a makeup product. We're trying to establish kind of a threshold level for finished good PFAS product testing. So when we do test and we see an unintentional amount of PFAS, what's that level? What's that threshold level? What does that mean? Because that's something that certainly brands are dealing with now. When you do have a detection, then what do you do? You know, knowing that it's an unintentional detection, you don't necessarily want to have a lot of product waste, but at the same time, you know, you've detected some amount of potential PFAS in your product. So we're trying to work on a protocol around that now. Let's see, any questions? Yeah, fluoride added to water, absolutely. Good point. What concentration levels are you seeing in products? Yeah, so there's a great study by Dr. Whitehead out of, trying to remember what university, who has tested PFAS levels in cosmetics. I will link you to that
I'm gonna
paper.
link a few studies, including
Perfect.
that one.
Thank you. And that is the most comprehensive study that we have right now that has specific PFAS levels or organic PFAS, or I guess organic fluorine levels in cosmetic products. And that study was, gosh, it came out like a year and a half ago now. But their lab is doing some pretty great work, and Credo works closely with them actually.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry, I'm sending some links. So Integral is trying to stay at the forefront at all PFAS related issues, including but definitely not limited to PFAS in cosmetics and personal care products. We've been internally tracking PFAS landscape, including regulatory changes, litigation, scientific findings. We've got a lot of expertise available for support on products, from product stewardship to environmental and human health risk assessments. Also, you know, those EPA comment periods, I know Integral helps out a lot with those, and especially with PFAS coming to the forefront. You know, we've helped companies come up with comments to bring back to the EPA, you know, questions, comments, suggestions, criticisms, the whole 9 yards. We also have a monthly PFAS newsletter subscription available, which summarizes newly published literature and regulatory highlights. And then we also have this really cool interactive map on the Integral website with the latest PFAS regulatory criteria for drinking water, groundwater, and surface water. And we're also hoping to expand that eventually to include things like, you know, cosmetic and personal care product reforms and changes.
Yes, please do. Credo wants that. Yeah, so what's next for PFAS and cosmetics? Supply chain transparency, I feel like I can't say that enough. Advocacy at the state and federal level, of course, analytical method development. We've just run through the gamut of the issues, and that doesn't necessarily cover all of the issues. Addressing unintentional routes of PFAS contamination, like, water, colorants, so on and so forth. Developing more strong toxicological profiles for PFAS in cosmetics, conducting dermal absorption studies, doing risk assessments for both past and current exposures, monitoring, just like one of the questions, biomonitoring, and more. And I just wanted to kind of wrap up before we take questions and say, that we don't want this to be a fear-mongering presentation. Of course, beauty products and cosmetic products are usually to use for fun or to use, they're not a requirement. There's not a medical treatment. It's not a sunscreen or SPF. It's not something you necessarily have to use. So you want the cleanest available because, that there's no reason not to have a clean product or to have a PFAS-free product. But at the same time, PFAS is ubiquitous in our environment. It's in our water, it's in our food packaging. Dermal absorption studies have indicated that there is a level of safety with some PFAS, and that it continues to be an area of study. So we don't want to scare anyone and say, the chapstick or face lotion or mascara that you're using every day is causing some sort of acute or chronic harm to your body. Really, it's when you look at PFAS exposure as a whole in all of the different areas of life. And that's probably more important than kind of focusing in on, one specific product. So don't go home and throw all your products away necessarily, but when you do need to replace, something to consider, certainly.
Okay, well, yeah, we've got another question. I think, Christina, you may have an idea about this. It's a question on colorants. How many colorants, SKU variations, does a cosmetic manufacturer purchase?
Gosh, that is a really good question, and super dependent on a brand. So an indie brand who's making, 5 lipstick colors would purchase many fewer SKU variations of colorants than, say, a multinational brand that has a matte line and a gloss line and all of the different lines with 40 plus colors. So that really depends on the specific brand. And sometimes it's really the contract manufacturer. So depending on the brand isn't making the product in-house, and it's a contract manufacturer that has purchased colorants, and they have, however many they need to have in order to make products for a bunch of different brands.
Any other questions? Got a couple more minutes.
Any information we can learn from you all? I know everyone has such varied backgrounds. We'd love to hear if you have any experience or anything that we can consider in our own work.
I think we're all just taking in all of this information.
I know, it's a lot.
I think you covered a lot of what we're concerned about. We're trying to look at sources of PFAS exposure and what we can do to reduce those sources. And like you were saying, what are the levers you can pull? Testing, what's the definition of intentionally added? How do you go after those? Who has control over certain things? I mean, it's really interesting, for me at least, the supply chain issues, what a cosmetics manufacturer has control over versus the suppliers.
Yep.
Tom has his hand up.
Hi, yeah, on one of your earlier slides, you mentioned, I think it was 0.1 parts per million would be considered incidental. And I'm wondering how you came up with that. It's something we're struggling with for food packaging, and we've heard from labs that it was 1 part per million. But how did you come up with that number? What went into it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I did not come up with that number on my own. So under so 0.1 ppm and above is considered intentionally added, and that is what several of the labs have come up with. So I could certainly send you the labs and their citations on that specific number. But basically, that's the lab's threshold for saying you should do further testing. You probably have an intentionally added PFAS, and we can probably figure out which PFAS it is. The unintentional lower levels are harder to chemical fingerprint. But that lab specifically was SGS Access, I believe. And I'm happy to send.
Was there any indication that was specific to cosmetics? Because I mean, we're looking at packaging. Is it relevant to say that could be a threshold for testing in packaging or just cosmetics?
It is a cosmetic specific number, and I don't know the groundwork of how the calculation was conducted, but I'm sure that there's certain areas that could be carried over to food packaging because there's a lot of commonalities between food packaging contamination and cosmetics contamination as well.
And we've got a question from Nemo's Terry Goldberg. She's asking if you can comment on what conversations are occurring within the cosmetics manufacturing and brands industry and what the industry is doing on its own to address this topic.
Oh, I see that now. I think I'm more visual. I have to read it. Let's see. Conversations that are occurring with cosmetics. I'm not sure I fully understand the question.
Terry, do you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Sure. What I'm interested in is what the, you guys meet with as an industry periodically. There are industry trade organizations and industry groups. And I'm just curious about what conversations are occurring within the industry about this topic and what, as an industry, companies are prepared to do. You listed a bunch of individual companies and what they're doing, what actions they're taking. I'm wondering if there's anything writ large that the industry is doing on the side.
That's a great question. So Personal Care Products Council is a trade association for personal care products, PCPC, and they are doing a lot of advocacy. They are behind the bills banning intentionally added PFAS. There are a lot of non-GOs, Environmental Working Group being one of the big name brand players, but there's also breast cancer prevention partners. There's a lot of groups that have an interest in eliminating PFAS from cosmetics, but the specific retailers and brands working together typically do so under a trade association like PCPC, and the secondary trade association to that is Independent Beauty Association, IBA, and they are also doing some advocacy work, but I don't think to the same extent.
Great, thank you. Any last comments or questions before we close out from anyone? And this will be available for all IC2 members. You know that we're creating a new website, so it should be ready this summer. So this will be posted on there, but also anyone that's in here now can grab any of the links that were shared or conversation in the chat as well. I will make
absolutely. And I'll put my email in the chat, and if Annalise is comfortable, can do the same. If you have any follow-up questions, we'd be happy. This is obviously an area that's very near and dear to our hearts. I did see one other question about everyday tips to give to the public to keep them safer. I would honestly say consumer demand and advocacy. Ask the brands, email the brands, say, what are you doing to protect me from PFAS? Let brands and manufacturers know that this is an area you're interested in, because that's how I feel the most change is happening. And similarly, anything that you can do to support, the acts that you feel are important, like the Supply Chain Transparency Act, and so on and so forth. But also, be cognizant of waste and our environment, and realize that a cosmetic product with PFAS is not ideal, but is not going to cause some sort of acute or chronic, terrible problem immediately. It's really the holistic approach to removing PFAS from our environment that matters the most.
Thank you so much, Christina and Annalise, for sharing all of this information. And if anyone has any other questions, their emails are in there, or you can send it to me and I will forward along to them, and vice versa. If you have any questions for us after this.
Great, thank you so much. And if anyone does any work in food packaging or PFAS, shoot us an email. We'd love to collaborate and hear what you all are doing.
Do so.
Yeah.
We can do that. That sounds
Thank
great.
you.
All right. Bye.
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 Thank you everyone for attending.